Just a quick book placement, product placement for my books under the author name Derek Hemingway. First, we have the first installment in The Human Saga, which is my epic trilogy of novellas about a future civilization of corporate fascism that is being invaded by an alien cult. We have The Mortician's Daughter, a dark fantasy set in Mesoamerica about a sorceress who blocks out the sun to create a kingdom of darkness and evil, full of ghosts and monsters. It's fucking awesome. Part 2 of the Human Saga, and then part 3. There's currently my first full-length novel in the works, so be on the lookout for that. That's about all. That heathen bastard! Alright, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel, to That Heathen Bastard. Today we are going to be discussing something that honestly just reveals that I've got a bone to pick with the government. And with our current modern age. Something people need to understand is what modern oppression is going to look like. Once again, I'd like to remind you that this is a platform for talking points, not a news show. With that being said, let's proceed. So, modern oppression. What do I mean exactly by modern oppression? Well, that's the thing. We first, of course, need to touch up on the idea of scientific progress. Scientific progress being that we are achieving greater and greater levels of technology, greater and greater amounts of knowledge about the universe, not necessarily a truly understanding, which is wisdom, but knowledge which can lead to wisdom. Right? Science tells us how the world works from a factually based standpoint. It tells us how people work. It tells us about the universe. And with scientific progress, we learn new secrets and new tricks as we become more and more in gnosis about the universe. And as we acquire gnosis, we acquire a certain ability to change the world. So with that being said, we now see a very different world and therefore a different kind of oppression. See, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Many things never truly change. In spite of how we might feel about change, sometimes it happens and sometimes it truly doesn't. With the ever-changing technology, you have ever-changing means of oppression or a means of freedom. You have ever-changing means of violence, degeneracy, and of course, worst of all, new means of rotting minds and rotting hearts. We never run out of ways to just completely ruin ourselves. We never run out. With that little diatribe over, I would like to share with you, real quick, the Oxford English definition of oppression. So, according to Oxford English Dictionary, oppression is cruel and unfair treatment of people, especially by not giving them the same freedom, rights, etc. as other people. Bravo! What a great definition that is. That is truly great, and that is exactly what I'm here to talk about. Unfair treatment to deny freedoms. What could better describe that than oppression through a digital means? That being said, the meaning of oppression truly is the removal of freedom through unfair treatment, through jackbooting, through arrests, through false arrests, through gunning people down, through fear tactics, all of which have been used and will be used by the state at some point. That is the true meaning of oppression. And the modern means of oppression now comes the fact that we actually live in two different spaces. Okay? We live in actual space, and then we also live in virtual space. Part of our lives are lived in actual space. That is the life where we work our job, buy our groceries, and then eat eat, sleep, shit, and fuck, and then die. And then there's the virtual space where we have in-depth discussion and communicate virtually through wires and tubes, making up the internet. Right? We exist in those two spaces at once. And we did that on purpose so we could communicate more easily and more efficiently. Of course, all that really ended up doing is just kind of exposing this core of rot and decay that was always there, but because of our greater connectivity, it just became significantly more obvious. So that becomes the meaning of our new reality. That later connectivity, and with that connectivity, we're not only connected to freedoms, but to oppressions, to oppressors. And modern means of oppression now are things like shadow banning and censorship, withdrawal of funds from GoFundMe's, controlling the flow of digital cash, using digital communications to send the IRS after people. It's a mix of physical and virtual oppression. Mixed. It is neither one or the other, it's a little bit of both. And it has a very nuanced approach and a nuanced front. That is the era we live in. Now, I, of course, wanted to talk about the trucker convoy, specifically the one up in Canada, but maybe also the one in DC. The one up in Canada, the trucker convoy, is blocking traffic in order to gain attention about the issue of vaccine mandates. They believe that vaccines should be a choice and not forced. I agree with this, especially in light of the fact that people with vaccines continue to get sick regardless of having vaccines. They get vaccinated and they still get COVID. Just recently, Queen Elizabeth of England had the triple vax, but still got sick. Because we are dealing with an ever-evolving virus that constantly changes, gains new variants, much like influenza. Which is why you can't really vaccinate effectively against an ever-changing virus. The good news is the death toll will be minimal properly, if it's calculated correctly, because COVID spreads really fast but doesn't really kill that well. It normally only kills the elderly. People who get COVID when they're young usually end up surviving. They can still spread it, but they're not going to die. The elderly are in danger, the young are not. If you get COVID, you should quarantine yourself in your home for, I think it was 10 days, I think, was the recommended quarantine time if you do get sick. I remember hearing that. I think that was from the CDC. I would prefer the World Health Organization myself. They've been more honest and more open with people than the CDC has. The WHO did say something about like 10 days, so about 2 weeks. Or something approaching 2 weeks of self-quarantine. I did have a coronavirus in 2020. I don't know if it was the coronavirus, if it was COVID-19, but I did the recommended 2 weeks quarantine. I did have a anxiety attack, a pretty bad anxiety attack triggered by the virus, where everything was terrifying. So I was texting people, calling people. At one point, even throwing on a mask and going inside, going inside the house with my family because I live in an RV on their front lawn, just so I could have someone to talk to, get over the anxiety. But I was effectively quarantined. I did not get very close. I was socially distanced, wore a mask, all that. You have no idea how awful those anxiety attacks can be. My God. You have no fucking idea. Just suddenly everything is scary. The cup on the table, the window, everything is just scary for no reason. So yeah, if you just quarantine yourself. And particularly stay away from the elderly, because you could end up killing them. The trucker convoy is absolutely right to make vaccines a choice. You should have the choice to say no or yes to a vaccine. Not only because the vaccines are relatively ineffective, but also because forcing someone to get an irreversible medical procedure is technically a violation of their human rights and a violation of their constitutional rights as well. It is not an acceptable form, and it is authoritarianism. It's exactly what Nazis would do. It's exactly what communists would do. Any authoritarian regime would do that. And of course, the Canadian government, I want to talk about Canadian government as being an authoritarian body. Because if you may have noticed, Justin Trudeau was all geared up to freeze the bank accounts of the truckers, private personal funds, which the government should have no control over. He was about ready to use emergency powers, a la Emperor Palpatine. Like, he was going to go all out. But then, of course, he revoked his powers later and sort of chickened out. I, of course, interpret this as cowardice on Trudeau's part, because when I look at Trudeau's personality and his body language and his general behavior, he does not strike me as a particularly courageous individual. I think he'll, fake courage when he feels he's safe enough to try it. But most of the time, he'll just sort of back down and display his lack of a spine. I definitely feel that way. I could be misinterpreting his personality, certainly. But I'm normally a pretty good judge of character. He backed down and revoked his powers because he's afraid. He was afraid of the pushback that he was receiving, and it was pretty robust. You had Canadians pushing back. You had Americans pushing back. Those of us who live in America down south were pushing back against your prime minister. Because everyone can see that this guy is an authoritarian asshole. He is Emperor Palpatine. He is Stalin. He is all the authoritarian evils we can imagine, or those real, or those imagined or actual. He is all of those things. Plus, he is a coward. The Canadian government is clearly more interested in maintaining control than properly representing your people. And the U.S. government, for those of you who are Canadians listening to this video or watching it, our government's not that much better. In fact, the majority of Democrats in our Democratic Party supported Justin Trudeau, showing clearly something I'd suspected for a time, that they were all sort of cut from the same cloth, right? That they were all the same general type of person. Trudeau's an authoritarian, and so are they. The Democrats want direct democracy, and they want direct control. They want to be able to essentially influence a mob of voters, sort of like how it was in the ancient Greece with the 40 tyrants. This is why democracy is terrible and why republicanism is superior. Republicanism uses voting, but also has the rule of law to prevent voter influence and mobs of voters and violence. It has rule of law. You don't vote on everything. You just vote for a candidate, and then that candidate makes the laws. That was Plato's gift to the world. The Democrats don't like that because it prevents them from achieving maximal power. That is, of course, my opinion. But generally speaking, our United States government is also very authoritarian. They're not too far off from where your Canadian government is at. Seizing assets, freezing bank accounts of private personal funds, dipping into your pocket pretty much whenever they want. And let's not forget the good old Patriot Act. They can literally arrest you at any time for doing anything that they would consider suspicious, and there will be nothing that you can do about it. They will lock you up in Gitmo, they will take away your rights, they will oppress you. And that is how government is run on this continent. Canada and the United States are literally making Mexico look very appealing right now. Right? The Mexican government is not known for doing that shit to people, as far as I know. It's actually known for being weak and backing down from cartels. It's too weak to oppress you. That may be the only alternative at this point. Holy shit. So the internet as it is today, I think is important to note that in the beginning, the internet was just a series of connected computers through a virtual space. And back then, pretty much all the internet content, for the most part at least, was user generated. You made all your own content. User generated content was the in thing. It was it. It was just it. Nothing better. Now, as the internet is today, it has become dual sided. You have the original internet, you have the Web 1.0 of user generated content, and you have the Web 2.0 of social media internet, where it's corporate generated content. And within that space, you have the clash of user generated and corporate generated, sort of clashing with algorithms and a kind of cold civil war where you have one side versus the other, left versus right, authoritarian versus libertarian, user generated versus corporate generated. And the corporate generated spaces on the internet will oppress you. The user generated spaces will not. That is not to say that the current state of user generated internet is not toxic. It most certainly is. I've seen the kind of people that hang out on Gab and Minds, and I've seen people in my BitChute comments. I know the kind of people that are out there. I know. But do not let that turn you off from user-generated content sites like BitChute or Gab. Because when it comes right down to it, at least you're not going to be oppressed there. You have the freedom to say what you want when you want to say it. These platforms are still relatively new and they need some time to grow. They don't have the power of the corporate-generated sites yet. But alt tech is new tech, as cited by StixHexNammer666. But you will be oppressed both physically and digitally in this new age. That is the new kind of oppression that occurs. You are now oppressed on two fronts because you exist in two fronts. You exist in the physical universe and in the virtual universe. In the physical universe, they can freeze your assets so you cannot buy groceries, you cannot buy food or water, and you will be left to starve and die of thirst until you do what they say. And then, of course, in the digital space, they will censor your voice, they will silence you, they will do whatever it takes to keep you quiet until you do what they say and become system approved. So, generally speaking, having an alt-tech presence of some kind is a must. My alt-tech presence at the moment is minimal. I am on BitChute, and that's about it. I might expand into Minds. I might expand into Gab. Having too many social media accounts to manage at once might get a little crazy. I'll have to figure out time to do all that. I'm still building my platform. My platform is new. My political ideology is relatively new as I marry up my philosophy and spiritual beliefs with my politics and create a kind of triad. And at the end of the day, that is the new sort of way of doing things, at least for me, and the new oppression will have to be avoided by going into alt tech. That is your only choice, in spite of the toxic space they're in. You want to try and avoid using banks. You might want to try credit unions. At the very least, when you take money out of a credit union, it's your money as opposed to their money. They don't really have membership fees. And you can choose to vote or not to vote within the union. It's a very sort of user-friendly space. I think the government could probably still freeze those, but at least it's superior. You can always leave cash. In like you can buy like a safe box, and you can store your money in a safe box somewhere in your home. Right? If you're afraid of the banks freezing, you can always store your money in a safe location. Maybe not necessarily in your home, but there's always somewhere you can keep it. You might also want to try NFTs or Bitcoin. I would recommend Bitcoin. NFTs are kind of bullshit. So generally speaking, there are ways the new oppression can be avoided, and it's largely going to be alt-tech. I didn't want to be one of those guys that pushes alt-tech. But at this point, I'm like, with what we've been seeing lately about the trucker convoys, cutting yourself off from the authority in an authoritarian world is an absolute must. Remember, in a world of conquerors, be unconquered, right? Disconnect yourself from the conqueror. Make yourself unavailable. If you don't want to be conquered by Alexander, get out of Alexander's way. And then finally, I would just want to close this off with please protest the mandates, but do so peacefully. Do not get violent. Do not give them fuel. Wave your flags and shout your slogans and hold your signs up, but nothing more than that. Limit yourself to that alone. Be peaceful, but also be loud and obnoxious as hell. And when they start saying things like honk honk as a secret code for Heil Hitler, I can't believe they actually believe that. That honk honk is a secret code for. Leftists get crazier and crazier by the day, and it is so fucking hilarious. They live in the weirdest reality of all time. The woman who said that was in the Canadian government, of all people. It is a literal government politician who said that. And my guess is she was probably experiencing a state of temporary psychosis. Temporary psychosis is a common enough problem. It affects most of us at various points in our lives. When we are in a highly emotional state, we are at risk of temporary psychosis, and psychosis being disconnection from reality. We have all at some point in our life experienced a temporary disconnection from reality. The level of severity may depend on how good your critical thinking skills are and how connected you were to reality in the first place. I'm assuming in her case, her connection to reality was weak and tenuous as it was. But yeah, protest peacefully and do not give them fuel. Do not. But that's the new oppression, and you should avoid it as much as possible. Anyway, with that being said, sun's getting dim. With that being said, there will be a link in the description below to my books. Please buy, download, read them. And as always, choose peace.